Good morning. Welcome to this Thursday, February 3rd meeting of the House K-12 Education Finance Committee. Remote hearings such as this are held in accordance with Rule 10.01. This rule has been posted online and is linked to in our public notice on the House website. All remote hearings will be recorded and live streamed by House Public Information Services. Members have the contents of their virtual packets available to them, and for the public, these same materials have been posted on our committee website. Members, if you're looking for all these items in one place, they are attached to the calendar event you have that Ms. Burt sent. To get on the list to be recognized by the chair, members using the Zoom interface have the ability to raise their hands via the app. Mr. Lee, could you please take the roll of the committee?
Yes, we'll start off with Chair Dabney.
Present.
Representative Sandstead.
Present.
Representative Kresha.
Present.
Representative Bennett.
Present.
Representative Daniels.
Present.
Representative Damith.
Present.
Representative Dravkowski.
Present.
Representative Erickson.
Erickson present.
Representative Feist.
Present.
Representative Jordan.
Jordan present.
Representative Marcourt. Representative Marcourt. Representative Mueller.
Mueller present.
Chair Richardson. Chair Richardson. Representative Thompson. Representative Thompson. Representative Walgamot.
Present.
Representative Shum.
Present.
Representative Yukim.
Present.
We have 14 members present.
Thank you very much. There is a quorum. Representative Feist, have you had the opportunity to review the minutes from our Wednesday, February 2nd meeting? And if so, would you be so good as to move approval?
Yes, I have, and I moved those minutes.
Thank you very much. Members, any discussion to the Feist motion? Seeing none, this is a voice vote. If members would please unmute. All those in favor of the Feist motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you very much. Members, today we'll be focusing on mental health concerns for both students and staff in our schools currently. We're joined by a number of testifiers, but I would like to start with Commissioner Mueller. Commissioner, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to your testimony. Please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Good morning, Chair Dabney and community members. My name is Heather Mueller, and I am the Commissioner for the Department of Education. And I appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you briefly before my MDE colleague, Heather Hirsch, shares her presentation. I first want to acknowledge the senseless tragedy that occurred in District 287 and the impact felt not only in their school community, but also in the Ridgefield School District community, as well as around the state. When I had the opportunity to speak to the staff who gathered in the building yesterday, I said that I'm sorry for their loss. And I also said that sorry isn't enough. Our students, our families, our staff, and our schools communities deserve better. Schools are more than the buildings. Schools are the people who are there every single day to build those relationships and learn and to teach. The safety, health, and wellness of our students and staff continue to be our utmost priority. And our talking with you today about mental health is one of the many conversations that we will need to have during this legislative session about truly meeting the needs of the whole student and providing support to our schools. The mental health of our students is not ancillary to our students' learning. It is of equal importance to academic learning. There was a time in education where the only focus of what happened in schools could be summed up in a song, reading, writing, and arithmetic. What happened outside of the school building had very little to do with what was happening inside the school building, where the hub of the wheel was the community, and the community assets and the support were the first to know and to respond to their students and families when they are in need. And then the school was there to support that response. Today, our schools have become the hub of the wheel. They tend to be the first to know when students and families are in need. They provide immediate supports when possible, and they connect families and students to community assets. Everything that we have learned, everything that we know about education through research and evidence-based practices clearly articulates that what happens outside of the school building has an impact on what happens inside this school building. While the contents of the song about what happens in schools continues to be true, the time of siloing and isolating the academic learning of students from their mental health no longer exists. Frankly, siloing and isolating students' academic learning from their mental health is a relic practice that has no place in education. As a society, we have readily acknowledged that in our education system, students who have in addition to that are included in their general education student status need and deserve more resources. A general education student who is also experiencing homelessness, a general education student who needs special education services, a general education student who needs English learner services, a general education student who needs free or reduced price meals. You get my point. However, designating resources to support a general education student who needs mental health services continues to be an invisible in addition to. It makes no sense. The research tells us that students coping with mental health concerns negatively impacts their ability to meet the many demands of school, including cognitive demands for learning, social and emotional demands for making friends and behaving according to the school rules, norms, and expectations, and the physical demands for being active in school throughout the day. We know that outside our students' homes, if they are lucky enough to have a home, schools are the most likely place where mental health concerns will be detected because they spend most of their day at school interacting with adults and their peers. As early as 1989, the Carnegie Council Task Force on Education of Young Adults said school systems are not responsible for meeting every need of their students, but when the needs directly impact learning, the school must meet the challenge. More recently, the Every Student Succeeds Act acknowledged the direct link between mental health and school outcomes and placed an unprecedented priority on wraparound services for young people struggling with barriers to learning, including programs that address mental health, school climate, violence prevention, and trauma. When school leaders have the resources and time to commit to addressing and meeting the mental health needs of our students, not only do the students themselves thrive, but also the entire community thrives. Actually, the school community and the general community population. We know that students who receive appropriate mental health supports have improved academic achievement, are more likely to graduate, and are more likely to attend and successfully complete college or enter into the workforce. Today, Heather Hirsch from our MDE School Climate Center will be providing a presentation that focuses on mental health topics specific to Minnesota students and highlighting just a few of the items in our supplemental budget. You'll hear about the rest of the mental health package and other programs that provide individual supports and wraparound services when we are able to present on the governor's overall budget. When we know better, we must do better. And we've known better for a very long time about mental health, and our students cannot wait any longer for us to figure this out. I believe that this was made abundantly clear during the student testimony yesterday regarding the need for mental health supports and services. Thank you, Chair Dabney, for convening this conversation on this incredibly important topic.
Thank you for those remarks, Commissioner. Ms. Hirsch, welcome to the 2022 session and the Education Finance Committee. If you'd please introduce yourself for the record and then proceed with your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Dabney. My name is Heather Hirsch. I work with the Minnesota Department of Education in the School Climate Center. And thank you, Commissioner, for your remarks. Thank you for inviting us to the committee. And thank you, Megan, for sharing my slides. I wanted to speak with you all a little bit about the mental health work that the Department of Education is going to take on, but I felt like I needed to frame the conversation around the current status of mental health and what we're seeing right now in Minnesota. Megan, if you could advance the slide. When we present at the Department of Education, we want to make sure that we are always tying our work back to our commitments of equity as an agency. And I think in mental health, this is equally critical. As I'll share with some of the data that our students aren't experiencing mental health needs equally. And this group and our legislature and our agency have the ability to make changes for those students. So I just want to thank you, Megan. I want to talk a little bit about the current status of adolescent and children's mental health in Minnesota. And then I'm going to talk about some of the proposals that the governor is moving forward in his supplemental budget around student support personnel, the workforce pipeline, schooling to behavioral health services, and Minnesota multi-tiered systems of support, and walk through a little bit of where we are in those different areas. So I'll start with some of the data. COVID has exposed this continuing pandemic that we find ourselves in has exposed the seriousness of this issue. Right now, 1 in 6 children aged 2 to 8 have a diagnosed mental health disorder. Often those diagnoses happen because of connections with district programs. Suicide is currently the second leading cause of death among individuals ages 10 to 34. And in Minnesota, we actually have a higher rate of suicide among youth aged 11 to 18 than the country. So I think it's really critical that we're addressing these mental health needs early. And we also know that during the pandemic, access to care was disrupted for many students. And so in 2020, during the pandemic, nearly half or over half of students diagnosed with major depression, so roughly 32,000 adolescents across the state, did not have access to healthcare. We also know from our school principals and our school support staff that mental health needs of students and of staff continue to be one of their biggest challenges that they're facing. We also know that according to the Minnesota Student Survey, which was pre-pandemic, our most recent data is from 2019, that mental health rates have increased from the 2016 administration to the 2019 administration of the survey for all grades and all genders. This will show you a little bit, as I mentioned, this is from 2019. It is winter, spring of 2022. Right now, the Minnesota Student Survey is in the field as we are meeting today during this legislative session, and we'll have updated data likely by the end of summer or early fall. So I think it's important to note female students are twice as likely as male students to report long-term mental health problems. And as you can see there, it only is increasing for our students as they get older. And so I think that just demonstrating the really critical need to get these supports into our schools and help us identify students as soon as possible. One of the questions that we ask on the Minnesota Student Survey is we ask students in the past 2 weeks, how often have you felt down, depressed, or hopeless? And this is looking at 2016 to 2019. So 2016 in the more navy blue, and 2019 in the green, showing just that increase of students who are feeling that in several times in the past 2 weeks, they have experienced the depression or hopelessness. And again, seeing that increase as students are aging. We also know that this is a challenge nationally. So the US Surgeon General issued an advisory on youth mental health crisis, highlighting the further challenges that were exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic just this past December, and warned that the situation has had dire impacts on mental health for American youth. With that, the US Surgeon General's office and the US Department of Education released a series of resources and other things to help address this. But one of the biggest challenges that we see is just access for our youth, continued access. The other thing I did just want to highlight is that a recent study that was published just this past January was an analysis of 36 studies over the pandemic, found that 80,000 youth had widespread anxiety and depression increases in those ages 19 and younger. And as the commissioner talked about, a lot of that has to do with the increase in screen time that students were experiencing when they were out of school, lower rates of physical activity, and then also coupled with fewer adults to ensure that students were staying out of dangerous situations. So just less interaction with those trusted adults that they're able to have access to when they're in the school building. We also know that COVID had impacts locally on our school-linked behavioral health programs. So pre-COVID, our wait list for treatment was approximately 200 students, which is still a challenge. The current wait list for treatment is approximately 800 students. That wait list is further impacted by a workforce shortage. And so you'll notice in our presentation and our conversation in the governor's supplemental budget, addressing workforce shortages is a priority. We also know that in the first year of the pandemic, 6% fewer youth had access to services, and youth of color were disproportionately affected by this access. In fact, we saw that in the beginning of the pandemic, 13% fewer Hispanic or Latina youth access mental health supports. And this is primarily looking at the supports that we're able to provide through the school-linked behavioral health program. As you can see from this graph, it's looking quarterly at 2019, 2020, and 21. So the progression over the pandemic. We definitely saw a decrease in students accessing our the services in 2020. But as they're getting back into school more regularly, we're seeing that we're seeing more students being able to access their services, but we're still not, as I said, completely caught up and then addressing the new concerns that have occurred during COVID with such a long wait list and with provider shortages. We also know the huge unmet needs that our students experience when they have the huge needs that students experience when they have unmet mental health needs. So high school students with significant symptoms of depression are twice as likely to drop out of school as compared to their peers, which is very concerning, especially the statistics that we saw that during COVID, so many Minnesota youth with symptoms of depression didn't have access to healthcare. We also know that unmet emotional needs impact children's ability to function in school. So it has impacts on their ability to learn, their ability to concentrate and make decisions. Mental health issues also show up as physical health concerns, which are again, keeping students out of school and making it difficult for them to develop healthy relationships with their peers and with adults. And oftentimes depression and anxiety come hand in hand. So as we're seeing students experiencing other mental health issues and unmet needs in their emotional health, we see an increase in anxiety and a loss of self-esteem. And a lot of these needs can be addressed if we're able to keep kids in school and keep them getting the services that they need. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of key areas that we are working to address through the governor's proposal and through work that we're doing at the Minnesota Department of Education. So I want to talk a little bit about student support personnel. And again, due to COVID, 2019 is the most current data that we have. And we see this in our, anecdotally in our calls and requests from schools, but there are lots of areas in Minnesota that lack or have insufficient number of mental health providers, especially those who can treat children and adolescents. I don't know that this will be news to anyone in the committee, but our school counselor, school social worker, and school psychologist rates in Minnesota, our staff to student ratios are significantly lower than the national recommendations. Often schools share these staff, or there's one district staff, or they're contracted part-time or staff. And so we just don't have access to these services for schools and that we need. I also wanted to just define student support personnel because that is a component of our recommendation. So when we talk about Minnesota, or when we talk about school support personnel in Minnesota, we're talking about individuals licensed to serve as a school counselor, school psychologist, school social worker, school nurse, or chemical dependency counselor in Minnesota. So all of these individuals are licensed providers and or licensed clinicians, licensed providers, and the majority of them share dual license to practice in work in schools. I want to talk also a little bit about the workforce pipeline and the workforce shortages that we're seeing. So we continue to have challenges filling mental health professional positions. There are two sort of main reasons. One is just the size of the pipeline, the number of individuals going into this work, and the rate at which the graduates become licensed. And so I want to talk a little bit about kind of what we mean with both of those. Megan, if you could advance, thank you. So as of 2015, we employed an estimated 22,000 workers in mental health related occupations, both licensed and non-licensed, which is not a lot because that isn't just looking at schools. In 8 years, in an 8-year period from 2006 to 2014, Minnesota colleges and universities produced nearly half that number of graduates in mental health related programs. So we just don't have individuals going into those fields in Minnesota at the rate that we need to. And then the other challenges of those 9,800 Minnesota graduates, only half obtained their professional license or practitioner license. So only half of those individuals would then be eligible to obtain dual licensure to work in their schools. Some of the challenges to obtaining licensure are highlighted here. Often there's a high number of supervision hours. So it's generally around 4,000 supervised hours or 2 years of work. And those supervision hours are not not reimbursed for the supervisor. So the burden for organizations to supervise practitioners is very high. They need someone to supervise this individual for 2 years and aren't able to seek reimbursement for those services. The out-of-pocket expenses for supervision to obtain licensure is a significant barrier that we hear from professional associations, from students, and we also know that it is especially impacting Black, Indigenous, and people of color moving into these professions. I'll talk a little bit about our schooling to behavioral health services. Just as a very brief primer. So our schooling to behavioral health grants from DHS connect or co-locate effective mental health services in schools. This map shows all of the different providers that have been funded. Currently, there are 57 providers. They're providing services to over 50% of the schools. But as you can see, obviously, we are not meeting all of the needs that our students have. One of the pieces of work that we've been successful in partnering with DHS around is looking at piloting efforts to support educators through our school-linked behavioral health services. So typically those resources are aimed solely at students, but we also recognize with the pandemic that there's a significant impact to our educators. And so looking at small ways that we can provide additional support to educators through this program. So there's a pilot effort that we've been working with DHS on to provide increased support for teacher mental health, which includes drop-in consultations for school staff to meet with the related services therapists, presentations for school staff around supporting students in their mental health, and small groups for teachers to process and to obtain support from their peers and from a licensed professional. There's also been an effort to provide increased self-care and compassion fatigue training to our education staff in the partner school districts, as well as developing processes to do teacher consultation and reflective consultation. So those are just two different options for teachers to have access to the support staff, the therapists during school hours or after school hours, that then can be allowable as part of the services under the School into Behavioral Health Grant. Some of our continued challenges. So as I mentioned, that was a pilot program that DHS is able to do, but we also know that just educators are challenged right now and their well-being is a huge challenge. So we know that we need to work to increase prep time for educators to allow for that planning, reflection, and professional development that they need, and so that it is during the school day for them. We need to create sustainable funding for those reflective consultation programs with staff. It gives them an opportunity with a licensed professional to talk about what they're seeing with their students and learn and process from their peers, and also ensure that staff are working at the top of their license. This is a phrase that I am bringing from my time working in public health, but just ensuring that our licensed staff that we already have so few of in schools are able to do the work that they really need to be able to do at their license. And so evaluating the roles that they're playing in the schools and making sure that their priority is seeing and treating students over other things that occasionally get added to their plate, especially right now with our staffing shortages. I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-tiered systems of support and the work that we're doing in this area as well. Minnesota has what we are calling Minnesota's multi-tiered system of support that MDE is leading the efforts on. It is a new proposal for statewide support. We are really looking at what MTSS or multi-tiered systems of support look like in schools and how MDE can continue providing additional supports in that area. We've started this work almost 2 years ago with a grant from CASEL, the Collaborative of Academic and Social Emotional Learning, and CCSSO, the Council of State Chiefs, to build upon existing work that we've been doing in the MTSS space and social emotional learning and equity to develop statewide guidance that supports the whole child. So really focusing on MTSS as how school really should happen for all students. That work has been supported by our executive leadership at MDE. We brought together an external task force of 40 individuals from across the state, various educators. They helped to develop the definition and identify the needs that schools have in this space. And that has been guiding the work that we're doing. We're also able to leverage technical assistance from the federally funded Wisconsin-Minnesota Comprehensive Center, which is located in the University of Minnesota Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement. That funding and that technical assistance that's provided by the federal government is allowing us to move a lot quicker in this work than we would be able to on our own. So the definition that the external task force developed and presented to MDE is listed on the page. And I think it's really important to note the language that the committee really felt important to use. So Minnesota MTSS is a systematic continuous improvement framework for ensuring positive social, emotional, behavioral, developmental, and academic outcomes for every student. Minnesota MTSS provides access to layered tiers of culturally and linguistically responsive, evidence-based practices and relies on the understanding and belief that every student can learn and thrive. In addition, it engages an anti-bias and socially just approach to examining policies and practices and ensuring equitable distribution of resources and opportunity. Our Minnesota MTSS framework has 5 core components and has some developed resources to describe the optimum functioning of a Minnesota MTSS system. So our core components are infrastructure for continuous improvement, family and community engagement, multi-layered practices and support, assessment, and database decision-making. And we intentionally are prioritizing infrastructure and family and community engagement in this model because we recognize how critical family and community and student engagement in their learning process is to student success. And so I think that is one of the unique pieces of the model that we're putting forward as an agency and as a task force that doesn't exist in other models. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the governor's supplemental budget proposals that relate to those 4 different areas that we just highlighted as being part of the children and adolescent mental health concerns. So one of the proposals is around funding to schools for support personnel. And so as I mentioned, student support personnel includes nurses, counselors, social workers, school psychologists, and chemical dependency counselors. The proposal that is being put forward would fund up to 370 additional school-based student support personnel. Districts would receive aid in the form of per pupil allocation dollars based on enrollment of the previous year, or a minimum of $35,000, recognizing that should allow them to contract for or bring on roughly half an FTE. We also acknowledge that intermediate school districts and other cooperatives have significant needs in this area and would also receive an allotment to add to their student support personnel. With that, though, we do know that there is more work we need to do in this area. And so one of the projects that my team is fortunate to lead with DHS is really looking at the procedures for Medicaid billing of non-IEP, so services for non-special education students, and looking at what we can establish to identify some continued support for this work. So we are able to fund an FTE at DHS who will continue looking at this and studying this challenge with our partner school districts in the Project Aware grant. We have 6 of them across the state, but then also with school linked behavioral health providers through DHS as well. So we look forward to what that position will learn and be able to share with us as we guide this work. As I mentioned, workforce development is one of our biggest challenges. As part of the student support personnel, we also recognize that investing alone in hiring is not going to help us solve the problem, and that we need to be really thoughtful of and thinking to the future and how we would continue to fill these positions as we see the need growing. So our workforce development proposal includes workforce development strategies, specific strategies to increase student support staff of color, respecialization strategies for psychologists and counselors to obtain school licensure, which would increase the number available to work in schools, recruitment initiatives around addressing the challenges that the licensure process is for school support personnel. As I mentioned a few times, working in the schools creates an additional burden of obtaining dual licensure. And so that is another barrier for individuals going into working in schools. And then again, around retention. So looking at pilot programs to offer funds to provide paid supervision hours and loan forgiveness for individuals of color going into this field, or individuals in greater Minnesota or rural Minnesota where there's a provider shortage. We hope to do that with interagency agreements to other state agencies, including DHS and higher education, as well as the state student support personnel professional associations and mental health providers. As I mentioned again, by providing scholarships and loan forgiveness, expanding access to cultural competency training for providers, and looking to expand existing programs that are trying to increase the social work, the diversity of the social work field. So there are 2 programs in particular that have found relative success in this area, and we would partner to advance both the diversity social work advancement program and the pathways program that are working to increase workforce diversity and retention. And again, with our workforce development, this work obviously will help. It will add more staff working in schools, but we also know that we need to continue to work to increase the number of graduates from Minnesota-based mental health related programs. It is challenging to attract folks who aren't going to school here to come to Minnesota, as we know in lots of other places, but also providing funding or reimbursement for those clinical supervision hours outside of pilot programs or grant programs. Working with licensure to address, again, those dual licensure challenges for school-based staff. Maintaining both a clinical license and a school license. How can we look at making that process easier? And then again, considering the success that we've had with Grow Your Own programs around educator staff, what could that look like, or what are other states doing or other places doing around Grow Your Own programs for support staff? Is that a reality that we could consider and look at developing? We also know our school-linked behavioral health work, that pilot program that we started, we would love to see continue and become more permanent. And so we would look to expand the ability to provide that coverage for supervision hours in our pilot sites, as well as dedicated funding to provide staff supports through the school-linked behavioral health program. So those teacher consultations, the clinical supervision, the reflective consultation with educators, working with DHS to continue that interagency agreement to expand that grant program, to continue the pilot and continue doing that with dedicated funding, specifically focused at providing services to educators, which we know is very needed right now. We also have goals around our Minnesota multi-tiered system of support, as well as the commissioner mentioned other goals around our education and mental health services, but really looking at the Minnesota MTSS model as a way to provide some of that infrastructure and engagement that districts need. So looking at expanding our Department of Education and regional centers of excellence capacity and providing grants to school districts to implement Minnesota MTSS. That includes requests to continue the legislative allocation for letters, which is a Tier 1 core instruction program based on the science of reading. Expanding access to schools to the BAR program, or Building Assets, Reducing Risks Center work across Minnesota. That is a program based here in St. Louis Park that is an SEL program and one of the only programs aimed at improving social emotional learning skills in secondary schools that also shows academic outcomes. The funding would also be to provide tribal relations training to staff who are engaged in this work, knowing how critical that is to us in Minnesota, and increasing our capacity to better provide services and partnerships to our tribal partners is a priority. It would also allow for us to maintain our partnership with the University of Minnesota to continue to support the implementation of it and evaluation of this work that we're doing with the Minnesota MTSS framework. As all things in education, we want to make sure that as we are doing them and working with schools, that we're continuing to evaluate how that is working and making improvements as we go. We have some additional efforts that are already underway at MDE to provide educator support and well-being. So as best we can, we continue to provide free resources to educators around well-being and support. Often educators, they'll have to seek them out and complete them on their own time, which poses challenges, but we do have over 16 hours of social emotional learning modules that are available for group or self-paced educator learning with reflection, assessment, and continuing education credit that exist on the MDE website and have been nationally recognized by our partners. We also anticipate very soon having 3 additional hours of mental health support focused on, again, group or self-paced modules focused on understanding self-care and compassion for educators and trauma. We're also partnering with PALSB to consider the teacher standards of effective practice, which are going through a revision right now, what it would look like to include adult social emotional competencies as part of that revision process, so that we're really ensuring that teachers are building their own capacity around social emotional wellness as part of their teacher prep programs. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, committee. I believe I have a little bit of time to answer questions, if there are any.
Ms. Hirsch, thank you very much for that thorough overview. Members, any questions? Again, you may use the raise hand function, assuming you're on the Zoom app. Ms. Hirsch, you seem to have covered the top. Oh, Representative Bennett, please proceed.
Thank you. And this may be a question more for the somebody here from the Department of Education, based on some things I heard in this presentation. But I'm just wondering, so it was mentioned a few times that the pandemic exposed a lot of mental health issues, which I do believe it did. But we also know from a number of studies that our response to the pandemic, the lockdowns and school shutdowns and push out to remote learning, caused a lot of mental health issues. So my question is, for the Department of Ed, what are we doing to make sure that schools are offering in-person learning to every student that needs that and requires that? Because it really concerns me that we still have students being pushed out into remote learning when we hear increased screen time and things like that is a cause of mental health issues. So just wondering what we're doing with the Department of Ed to encourage schools to offer that in-person learning.
Ms. Hirsch, is that one for you, or is there someone else from the department who would want to tackle that question?
Chair, I'll defer to Commissioner Mueller.
Commissioner?
Thank you, Chair
thank you.
Dabney. Yeah, thank you, Chair Dabney and Representative Bennett. I think a couple of things that we know is that based off of this school year, there are no other options outside of online learning that exists within the statute. And so safe learning plans no longer exist. The ability to move students outside of how they're having e-learning days for inclement weather, or which has to be approved by the board, or school districts partnering with their school boards, their school leaders to make decisions about moving to online learning. It has to be done at the local level. And so there is an expectation, not only in the online learning statute, but in general, the expectation is that students are in school and receiving in-person instruction. If a school district needs to, or charter school needs to move to online learning, there is also an expectation that when they do that, they still also offer in-person learning as well.
Representative Bennett, any follow-up?
Thank you. So I'm hearing there's an expectation, but there's no requirement. Is that correct?
No, it is a
Commissioner
requirement.
Mueller?
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, Chair Dabney and Representative Bennett. Yes, it is a requirement.
Okay.
Representative
Mr.
Bennett?
Chair, thank you. So I'm a little confused. So then how are, I know some schools have pushed for periods of time anyway to go to all e-learning again. And so how does that fit into this requirement?
Commissioner?
Chair Dabney and Representative Bennett, in the online learning statute, school districts had to apply to become online learning providers, and that can be done either for their students who are in their school district or charter school, or students who are outside of their district or charter school. Within that, they have the opportunity to move districts or students to online learning, but they are required to have that voluntary. And so any student who needs to come in or wants to come in during that time by statute is required to offer in-person opportunities for students.
Okay, Mr. Chair, one more, if I could, thank you. So no schools are allowed to basically shut down like happened last year. That's my understanding then, that they have to offer that in-person learning.
Commissioner?
Chair Dabney and Representative Bennett, that is true.
Thank you. Okay.
Representative Joachim, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Comment and then just a quick clarification or question on some of the good work around MTSS. I just want to make sure that we're really careful about how we use our words. Schools didn't shut down. Schools had to pivot to distance learning at the beginning of the pandemic, and then came back in the fall and did the best they could to get kids back into the classroom or provide the services that they need. And we have teachers and staff and administrators and school boards doing amazing work trying to either catch kids up developmentally from being out for a few months, or really making sure that they're getting what they need. And they're feeling the pressure. As you see at the beginning of the slides, we talked about both students and staff mental health. Having us say that we shut down, they're not doing their job, that can really take a toll, not only on the students and the teachers, but also the parents that did amazing work with their kids at home. So I can't say this enough when we pick to choose our words carefully, just to think about the people on the other end of those words. But pivoting to a better note, I was really excited to hear about the data you're collecting around the work BAR is doing and the expansion of the MTSS system. Could you tell us a little bit more about how schools will be able to access the potential grants that we're trying to fund around MTSS, and some of the results that you've seen when schools can implement this kind of umbrella framework to make sure that we're meeting all students where they're at and all the needs that they have.
Ms. Hirsch? I believe that one was for you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Representative. I can talk a little bit. As a proposal, we would be looking at them to be competitive grants for schools and districts that are implementing the Minnesota MTSS framework. So we'd have staff that could provide support through this proposal at MDE and regionally, but then also as a component of that, they would have options around some different programs that they would want to be implementing, such as letters or BAR. So that would allow them access to and some funding to support their staff time for the implementation of those types of multi-tiered programs. And I can speak a little bit to my knowledge of BAR. More and more schools in Minnesota are accessing it, but it is a national program. And as I mentioned, it's the only or one of maybe two secondary social emotional learning programs that also has academic outcomes in both math and reading. And so we do see that as being really critical. Obviously addressing social emotional needs of kids is my area of expertise and passion, but knowing that how much that can help improve their academics as well, I think is really critical.
Representative Joachim?
Thank you for that. And I think it's very important, as you say, that we're collecting that data afterwards to make sure that it's being successful, especially not just in reaching kids where they're at social emotionally, but also in that academic piece. Nice to see that letters was put up there too under MTSS. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Joachim. Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation, MDE. One word of caution, however, on mental health exploding is that when my grandson returned to the classroom, he's a 5th grader, he was told that he was anxious and probably depressed, and he was not. But that got into his head, and so he went home, to discuss with his parents this issue. So I think, a word of caution that children aren't forced into thinking they're depressed or anxious when perhaps that was not true of them. So, to make a blanket statement to a class, I think we have to be very careful of that as we move forward. So that was my comment. My question is for Ms. Hirsch. How do we engage parents in these mental health issues as we go forward?
Ms. Hirsch?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Representative. I think that was one of the main reasons that we wanted to talk about our Minnesota MTSS efforts, because of the huge emphasis on family and community engagement. Schools will need to employ lots of different ways to engage their families. um, around these topics. And what we are seeing schools starting to do is more parent education around those topics of depression, anxiety, student mental health, presentations for families and parents around potential signs of suicide ideation so that they're able to recognize those signs. But also it'll be really critical in our MTSS proposal and our work that we're promoting already. It does really emphasize the importance of building relationships with our families. And so as school staff, and especially as our mental health providers and support staff, needing to really do the work of meeting families where they are, of connecting with our families, of leveraging our community partners, and really making that a priority, which is again why we elevated that in our Minnesota MTSS model. And I'll Chair, is it okay if I ask the commissioner if she has additional comments?
Absolutely. Commissioner, do you have any additional comments?
Thank you, Chair Davney, and thank you, Heather, and Representative Erickson. I think the other thing that we know is that, to your point, Representative Erickson, when you talked about that for your grandson, the inclusion and partnership with our families and or caregivers for our students is incredibly important, because we do believe that they do know their students best. And so making sure that we have the opportunity to have dialogue with them about what they can be looking for proactively, so that they have an idea of what they are looking for first and foremost. And second is if they have identified an area of concern, or if the school may be identifying an area of concern, that there is nothing that is going to be done to students, but is done with our families in partnership with on behalf of our students. And so there's never going to be an instance, as we are doing this work in our schools, where we would be, to your point, forcing any type of diagnosis that's coming out of a school. That does not happen. What it is that we are providing the proactive supports, and the supports consistently in place, but working with our families to ensure that this is a true partnership and not a done to you, but a done with you.
Representative Erickson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Commissioner, does that mean that you're going to have some policy language that comes to us in regard to how teachers or schools and charters will engage parents, or do you think we have language in place already?
Commissioner Mueller?
Chair Daphne and Representative Erickson, I think there's a couple of pieces. One, will be embedded in the language where we're talking about multi-tiered systems of support and what that looks like, sounds like, and feels like is implemented in a school, as well as not only having that language in statute, but also having that language actually done administratively as well, and the expectations that go along with any type of grant that would be provided as a basic component of that grant. In order to receive it, you need to have how you are going to be engaging and partnering with families. And so there are pieces that are combinations of both. We do have also some statutory language that does help to reinforce the need to engage with families and caregivers.
Representative Erickson?
So Mr. Chair, just one final comment. So Commissioner, I hope this will be evidence-based, considering that Representative Bennett worked hard to get that language into our grant system, and that you will be able to follow the results and provide some data, so we know that indeed these efforts are going to pay off for our children and for our staff in our schools. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Erickson. Members, next, well, before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge that Representative Thompson has joined us, and Representatives Richardson and Marquardt were excused for today. My apologies for not communicating that earlier. Next, we have Dr. Braden Schmidt, a school psychologist, to provide her perspective. Dr. Schmidt, welcome to the committee. Thank you for being here today. If you would please introduce yourself for the record and then proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Dr. Braden Schmidt. I am a school psychologist for Intermediate District 287. I have worked as a school psychologist for the past 10 years and in child mental health for the past 18 years. The last 2 years have been by far the most challenging for me as a mental health professional in schools. However, I'm increasingly concerned that the next few years and beyond are going to bring even more challenges for student mental health, as students and educators work to process and recover from the collective trauma we have all experienced during this time. As I'm sure most of you are aware, on Tuesday, our District 287 community experienced a horrific event that led to the injury and loss of student life due to gun violence. Our community is devastated by what happened, and we are grieving this loss together. This week, our district mental health team is working to support staff and student mental health and help our community move through this tragedy. I will not be commenting further on those events today. Schools, more than ever before, have become the primary access point for child mental health care. When all of the child psychiatric beds at the hospitals are full, when there are long wait lists for day treatment or child therapists, or when families are not able to get their children to these services because they are working multiple jobs, schools become the only option available for students to receive the mental health supports they need. However, the staffing ratios for student mental health support staff in schools do not currently reflect these realities. And we are increasingly unable to do many of the primary parts of our job because we are being stretched thin by the overwhelming needs of our students. District 287 and other intermediates and cooperatives serve their member districts. We provide services that many districts cannot afford to offer themselves, such as low incidence special education services and services for higher need students. We are funded on a fee for service model and do not benefit from formula increases like other districts. My primary job as a school psychologist is usually to provide assessment, support, and intervention to students, to consult with teachers and collaborate with other school mental health staff to improve outcomes for my students. On a typical day pre-COVID, I would have spent my day observing students in their classrooms, testing a student's cognitive ability, conducting a functional behavior assessment of a student experiencing new and challenging behaviors, proactively checking in with students about how they're doing, or consulting with a teacher about a learning intervention for a student struggling with reading. Increasingly, though, I am being pulled away from my primary job responsibilities to support students and sometimes my colleagues who are experiencing significant mental health crises. Here are some of their stories. Last week, I was called to support an elementary age student of mine who was extremely distressed. He was hearing a mean voice in his head telling him that evil people were coming to harm everyone in the school building. I spent an hour with this student and another support staff helping to calm him and assure him that he was safe. And then I spent time reaching out to the student's mother to make sure he had the support he needed when he got home that day. On another day, we had to call an ambulance for a student who was expressing the intent to kill herself. As my colleague and I were speaking with the paramedics as they prepared to load the student into the ambulance, another student was being escorted past us by two staff down the hallway. That student had removed their shirt and was screaming and trying to harm the staff who were with him. The paramedics looked at me and asked if I thought we might need another ambulance. They looked a bit shocked when I said, no, thank you, that won't be necessary. That student will calm down and be fine. This is kind of normal for him. Unfortunately, what has become normal for us in schools is truly not very normal. Staff injuries are a frequent occurrence in my job. And in fact, I am currently one of the only support staff in my wing that is not on work restriction due to injury from students. This, of course, means that my own risk for injury is currently much higher than usual because I am responding to more calls than I ever would. It also means that I am again pulled away from my usual job duties to help support student and staff safety. A student support colleague of mine has been on shortened work days for months after she intervened with a student who was attempting to end her own life while at school. My colleague experienced whiplash and her third concussion at work while trying to restrain the student so that she would not climb over a balcony. My mental health colleagues are extraordinary people who come to work every day knowing that they may be harmed, and yet they show up the best they can because they care so deeply about our students. We know that schools are often one of the only consistent things in our students' lives, and that is why we show up. And yet I am increasingly concerned that we will lose some of our incredible mental health staff because we have been stretched too thin for too long and our own mental health is now suffering. When we have sufficient staffing, we as mental health staff can help our students grow and move beyond huge challenges. We are able to work proactively to help teach our students how to use coping skills to deal with big feelings. We are able to do daily check-ins with students to help them feel supported and connected. We are able to help connect families to the community mental health supports that they may need. In my district, when we are able to do these things, it can mean that our students are able to return to their home districts and go back to their neighborhood schools. In other districts, it means that students can avoid the need for more restrictive school placements. Despite their challenges, the students I am lucky to work with are amazing and resilient, but they are desperately in need of more mental health supports in their schools. Our students need more school psychologists, school nurses, school social workers, and school counselors. This is true in traditional schools as well as in intermediates and other programs that serve students with particularly high needs. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for prioritizing our students' needs.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt, and we appreciate District 287's consistent voice over the years for the needs of students who participate in school through level 4 programs in your district and across the state. So thank you for that. Members, next, we have Ellen Garola, a former teacher. Ms. Garola, welcome to the committee. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. My name is Ellen Garola. Before I begin, what some others have touched on, I just want to briefly share on what Commissioner Mueller was saying. I grew up in Richfield, so just a few blocks away from the South Education Center. I also volunteered for a few years and helped launch Richfield Young Life, which is a youth outreach foundation that many students, including the student who lost his life, was part of. I know numerous Richfield educators and school support personnel who are deeply grieving, but are having to put that aside to show up and support their students. Richfield's a really small and tight-knit community. So that means even students down to the elementary level are affected, and educators are trying to comfort and help them navigate and process this tragedy. I just wanted to share that because sometimes if you aren't in the schools day to day, it's difficult to understand just how much educators and staff do. But those in Richfield and District 287 are carrying a lot right now on top of an already extremely difficult year. And I don't want to take away from the recognition of the tragic loss of life as the community mourns and remembers, but I just want you to think about how you can support schools that support the community as they're trying to bring about healing. My own personal story is that this fall of 2021, I started my 10th year teaching middle school science. I never imagined it would also be my last year. I would tell people often that I was a classroom teacher for life, meaning I was an educator who had planned to spend my entire career teaching the classroom until I retired. But I ended up quitting exactly a month ago. I had to, for once, put my own needs and mental health first. Being a teacher this school year, you feel like you are constantly failing and not enough, even though the reality is you're set up to fail right now. Because of the low pay for paras, only 1 out of my 3 classes that needed support had it. That means during 2 periods, I'm trying to do the job of 2 people at the same time. Even though I gave it my all, it still wasn't not enough. Sometimes my own children had to quarantine and I would have to stay home with them, quickly running low on sick time due to the sub shortages that other teachers would have to cover my classes, which would make me feel guilty. Then I would return and try to cover the classes of other teachers who were out by giving up my prep instead of being able to catch up on grading and lesson plans from my absences. Once again, giving it my all, not enough. Many teachers have already run out of personal or sick days for the year, and it's only February. It's also stressful for other teachers on your team not knowing if the position will be filled by a sub or other teachers in the building. They are often arriving early and staying late to help prepare lessons for teachers who are absent on their team. On top of all that, the pressure of trying to help kids catch up academically, as well as trying to meet their social emotional needs. By the end of every day, I felt like, again, giving it my all, still failed. This is what many educators are facing every day. We love our students, which is what caused me to try and stay as long as I could, but is also emotionally draining watching them struggle and knowing you do not have all the resources you need to help them. Educators hurt seeing students struggle, and students hurt seeing their teachers struggle. A student I taught as a 6th grader who's now a senior sent me a message on social media that said, teachers should be the highest paying job. Without them, we wouldn't be smart enough to get a job or do much. They put up with so much. The state of the mental health for our educators is not good, but you have the power to change that. The best thing schools can do is to keep their current educators on staff. Teachers need time to teach. With expanded and protected prep time to talk with students and families, Our paras need higher pay in order to stay in the profession. And when our educators are sick, we need to make sure that they can stay home and recover before returning to the classroom. Our educators and ESPs are really hurting. When they are hurting, it hurts our students. They need more support and they need it now. Otherwise, incredible teachers who really care and are really good will continue to leave. Thank you.
Thank you for that powerful testimony, Ms. Garola. Members, questions? Representative Joachim, I see your hand up.
I just want to thank our last two testifiers, especially Ellen, for your work with our students. And I can hear in your voice the pain of not having enough staffing in our classrooms. I also have experienced that firsthand. I've been a para during the interim over the last 6-7 years. And this last year, I signed up to sub in 2 different districts, and I only signed up to sub from middle school down and with kiddos with special needs, but I could have probably been in 14 different places at least every day. The need is really out there, and I am married to a teacher. I'm the mother of a second-year teacher. I have 4 sister-in-laws that are teachers, and all schools across our state are experiencing the same problem with shortages. We knew we were running into this before COVID happened, and that we needed to beef up our workforce. That's why we've been working so hard on the Teachers of Color Act to get more students into the classroom, teachers at TOSI, and many of our other things. We need to make sure that our education system and those jobs are really honored again, so that people feel like it's a good career to go into. But I just want to thank you both, and so sorry for the loss for the 287 family. I cannot even imagine what you're going through right now, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Joachim. Representative Sandstead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also want to just echo some of the things that Rep. Joachim mentioned. I want to thank the last 2 testifiers. I went out on legislative leave last Friday. I am a teacher. This is my 28th year of teaching. And I was profoundly moved by everything Ms. Garola had to say. Everything is so accurate. And it doesn't seem to matter right now what part of the state you're in. This is a statewide problem. There are shortages everywhere. My prep time has been given up to cover my colleagues' classrooms. I'm thankful I've been able to stay in the classroom up until the legislature started this past session, but it is a scramble. Our student mental health needs are extreme. I've shared this with my colleagues, but we had a first grader bring a taser to school. And when we asked him, why would you bring this taser? He shared that he was going to use it on himself in case he made bad decisions or bad choices. And these are our babies, and they need so much support. Our school nurses are overworked. Our paras are in there's too great of a shortage. And you're right, pay is the issue. I have a para in my region up here who actually has to write the district a $50 check after every pay period to cover the health insurance, but does not take home pay. They actually work and then write the district a check just so they have health coverage. This is ridiculous. And the truth of the matter is right now, we need more adults working with our students, paras, teachers, and school support. And that is right. It isn't just paras. It's going to be our school psychologists, our counselors, our school nurses, mental health practitioners across the board, chemical dependency counselors. And I just am going to say I will be doing everything I can this session to make sure that is our focus. These are real needs. Ms. Garola, I would urge you, take a time out if you can, but come back to the profession. At least keep that door open. We would love to have you come back, and I understand the need of taking care of ourselves. I do want to share one other story about a colleague of mine early on in the year. A special ed teacher, I found her in the hallway crying, And she's an outstanding teacher. And it was before school even started, before kids were in the classroom. And I asked her what was going on. And she said, I've never felt more incompetent in my life. She said, I thought I was a good teacher, and she is an excellent teacher. But she said, I can't do it all. I cannot do my job and work with kids and do the paperwork and do everything that I'm being asked to do and do it well. She said, no matter what I'm doing, I'm giving everything I have to give. And I'm at the sacrifice of her own family. And she said, and yet every single day I leave feeling absolutely incompetent. And that's a horrible feeling. No professional wants to leave or spend their day in their job, in their profession, feeling inadequate, incompetent, insufficient. And, we're really there for the kids. We need to be there for the kids, but there's nobody propping us up either. And year after year after year, that is a very wearing profession. This morning I saw on the news that the unemployment rate in Minnesota, or the unemployment rate nationally, was down significantly, which is wonderful. But the bigger issue is resignations, and the largest group of people resigning from their jobs were educators. So I think today's hearing is profoundly timely in all of this. Again, thank you for all of the work that you've done. And I just appreciate your testimony very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Sandsteed. Representative Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I was hoping that perhaps Dr. Schmidt could go into a little bit more about what all of these mental health professionals do. She talked about how her role as a school psychologist and how that differs from that of a school social worker or a drug treatment counselor, and how does that care team work, and how is it supposed to work, and how is it working now?
Dr. Schmidt.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So generally, in the programs that I work in and just kind of in schools in general, the school psychologist is in charge of kind of helping to assess and intervene on both students' academic needs and their social emotional needs. So we kind of blend the two of those to make sure that they're able to do the learning that they do during the day. And what that looks like often is doing their initial evaluations and reevaluations for special education, doing consultation with teachers, and just kind of working on school-wide teams to help support academics and mental health in the school. Our social workers tend to do more of those kind of daily life supports for students and families. So they're helping to link students to outside resources, like if they are homeless and highly mobile, if they are food insecure, things like that. And helping to link to county resources or other things that might be more parent involved. And that's generally what our social workers do. Our counselors also do more kind of day-to-day check-ins with students as needed. And obviously our school nurses support our students' health needs, but they also are part of our mental health team and can help with assessments. Another big part of my job that's become increasingly part of my daily life is conducting threat assessments for students experiencing suicidal or homicidal ideation. That used to be something that was kind of an infrequent part of my job, and now I'm doing those on a daily basis. That is something I partner with our social workers to do. But like I stated earlier, we are stretched pretty thin, and because of COVID and other reasons, we often have staff outages. And so myself and our social workers often kind of have to cover for each other's jobs, and we're increasingly learning more about each other's jobs because we often have to do them for one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. Representative Jordan, any follow-up?
No, that's very helpful. And it does seem like it's important that we make sure that we have this continuum of care to make sure that students and staff's entirety of mental health needs are addressed.
Thank you. Ms. Gorola, you have your hand up, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add in too, I've worked at schools. So my last school I was in, we had full-time psychologists. I've worked in schools with part-time psychologists. So an example of what that might look like is if I have like a concern, let's say a student is discussing self-harm or something. When there is actually, we had more than one full-time school psychologist at the last school I was at. I could call them, address it. They could come get that student, address it immediately. When I worked at schools with part-time psychologists, it was, I would they would send maybe a counselor or someone who maybe didn't have all the backgrounds to deal with it because the school psychologist wasn't there or wasn't available that day because they were only part-time. Then you have this student who then leaves my room, goes to their next class, and I'm still sitting there going, were they addressed? Is anyone going to follow up? And having to then spend my prep time trying to track down and say, hey, who's talking to the student, who's called home, who's done that? Whereas when I have a school psychologist or someone, they can just come immediately and address it. And that makes a huge difference because then in your mind as a teacher, you're taking on a lot of that and trying to like follow up and do that and make sure that the student's safe and that at home knows and they're able to get that support, if that helps.
Thank you, Ms. Garola. Members, our last testifier today is Sue Abderholden with the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill in Minnesota. Ms. Abderholden, welcome to the committee. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. Sue Abderholden, Executive Director of NAMI Minnesota. You know, I've come before this committee in the past to talk about the mental health of our children. We know that about 20% of children have a mental illness, and prior to the pandemic, we struggled to meet their needs. I'm saddened to say that our children's mental health is much, much worse, and our ability to meet their needs is also worse. So if we think about the impact of the pandemic, right, loss of structure, isolation, lack of exercise, lots of actually inappropriate screen time, loss of interaction with other children, economic struggles in the family, fear and anxiety over catching COVID or a family member catching it, missing regular health checkups, deaths in the family. Nationally, more than 1.5 million children have lost a caregiver during COVID. And when adults have poor mental health, that actually impacts children's mental health as well. And especially for high school students, we've seen the impact of COVID and the lack of progress on issues that are of concern to them. Things like, climate change, racial justice, opioid epidemic, gun violence just adds to their anxiety and depression. And then adding to that, the murder of George Floyd and the attack on Asian Americans. For children who had a mental illness prior to the pandemic, they were at greater risk actually for developing more serious symptoms. Our children don't always have the tools to address the trauma and the impact of the pandemic on them. Not all children were able to use telehealth due to the lack of privacy in their homes or unstable or no internet. And now what we have is a full-blown crisis. As you heard before, the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and Children's Hospital Association declared a national emergency in children's mental health, citing the serious toll of the COVID pandemic on top of existing challenges. The U.S. Surgeon General also issued an advisory to highlight the urgent need to address the nation's youth mental health crisis. I've looked at a number of different studies, surveys, even the CDC. Globally, 25% of youth experience depression and 20% experience anxiety. Only 1/3 of high school students felt they were able to cope with their sources of stress. Healthcare claims for kids ages 13 to 17 went down, but mental health claims increased sharply. There was an increase in emergency department visits for mental health, 24% for ages 5 to 11 and 31% increase for ages 12 to 17. There was a 50% increase in suspected suicide attempts among girls aged 12 to 17. 1 in 3 high school students and half of female students reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. A survey of LGBTQ youth found that 73% were reporting symptoms of anxiety and 67% depression. Solitary substance use, as opposed to using with others, has increased among adolescents, with claims for substance use disorders and overdoses increasing. Self-harm claims in teens nearly doubled from April 2019 to 2020. For 19 to 22-year-olds, claims for emergency department visits for schizophrenia increased a little over 61%. And 2/3 of parents report that their child has struggled with their mental health, and 1/3 say that their child's mental health is worse than before the pandemic. In a study that literally came across my desk this morning from Boston, where they actually screened children and interviewed parents who were largely Black, Hispanic, and non-English speaking, and were being served in a safety net hospital, they found that depression and anxiety increased from 5% prior to the pandemic to 18% now. And while these statistics are sobering, the stories of families calling into our office are heartbreaking. A 14-year-old with autism who is also having hallucinations and had a suicide attempt, and there is nowhere for him to go, and in-home services are non-existent. A teen in an online school due to a family member being at high risk of catching COVID, with no friends, feeling depressed and suicidal, and she won't engage in therapy online. A young adult experiencing a first psychotic episode needs residential treatment upon being released from the hospital. The wait is 3 to 4 months. And these are just calls into my voicemail last week. While this is all pretty sobering news, we do know that children can be resilient and they can get better if we help them. Some children even did okay during the pandemic. They slept more, weren't bullied, didn't feel as pressured with schoolwork, and had more flexible schedules. They weren't racing from one thing to another. Some of the feelings students are experiencing, fear, anxiety, sadness, may disappear when COVID spread actually slows down. Studies show that after disasters, many people's initial reactions disappear, but for others, if you do not intervene, they will worsen, and this could impact them for the rest of their life. Schools have an important role to play in all of this. We know that when children are engaged in school and are successful, that often their mental health is better. It can play a protective role. So we really need to think about how we do this, recognizing that our teachers have been through a traumatic period as well, and they're exhausted. We don't even have enough bus drivers to even take children to school some days, and we are in the midst of a mental health workforce crisis. But we can't just throw our arms up in the air or feel overwhelmed by the situation facing us. Here's some things we can do. Support social emotional learning programs. Young children in particular, grades K through 3, missed out on really a lot of important social development, and older children could benefit from things like meditation and mindfulness training. Eliminate suspensions, especially for elementary school children. Young children don't have the words to describe how they are feeling or what has happened to them. We need to teach them and help them, not punish them. Support trauma-informed schools so that schools are absolutely a positive, safe, and affirming place for kids. Create a continuum of supports in the school that includes school support personnel, schooling to mental health, full service schools, and I would add education and support to families. Support teachers and other school staff's mental health. The mental health of adults in the building is critical to student success as well. Promote continuous enrollment in Medicaid so there's no gaps in services and treatment. Support early childhood mental health programs so we can intervene early. Fund extended school year for children and youth who have been in residential treatment, juvenile justice, or day treatment so they can catch up with their peers and experience success. Create a lead within the Department of Ed whose sole focus is mental health of the students and teachers and staff, and that person can serve as a clearinghouse of resources and good ideas. They can provide consultation to schools when a child dies by suicide to ensure safe messaging and to not promote contagion. Build the mental health workforce, including making it more culturally diverse so that we can meet the needs of our children. I will say that Representative Vang will be introducing a bill building on what you passed last year. Create children's mental health crisis homes as a short-term alternative to inpatient and residential treatment. And while this really isn't your jurisdiction, we need the private health plans to step up to the plate and pay for children's mental health treatment. That means increasing the rates for children's inpatient psychiatric care to make it financially viable for hospitals to add beds, paying for psychiatric residential treatment facilities, paying and following mental health parity for day treatment, and opening up their networks so there aren't 3 to 4 month wait times to see a psychiatrist or therapist. We were making progress prior to the pandemic, but the increased need has simply overwhelmed our fragile system. As adults, we need to take action in our own homes, our communities, and here at the state legislature. I appreciate your efforts in the past and urge you to work diligently to address the crisis among our children and youth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Abderholden. Strong overview and a lengthy list of tasks you've outlined for the committee. I appreciate that. Members, with that, our work is completed for today. I want to thank all of the testifiers for coming and sharing their insights, experiences, and professional experience to help us better understand the needs around mental health for both students and staff in our schools at the present time. With that, members, we'll see you tomorrow. No, we won't. We'll see you next week. It's Thursday. Have a good week and a good weekend. Thank you all. We are adjourned.